He didn't build towers, he built trust, and he was born in 1919 in a neighborhood that was neither poor nor privileged, one of those in-between places that raised dreamers with calloused hands. His father worked on the docks, his back bent from years of hauling the weight of other men's wealth. His mother sold pralines by the streetcar stop. On good days, she'd come home with a few dollars, on bad ones with nothing but sugar on her fingers. But she never came home defeated. They taught their son that ownership was the only real freedom. If you don't own it, his father said, it owns you. Charles carried that sentence like a compass. He wasn't loud, but he listened closely. He had a way of paying attention that made people nervous. The kind of silence that meant he was learning something he wasn't supposed to. He learned how the city worked, and more importantly, who it worked for. When he turned 22, war pulled him away. He enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers, trading his hammer for a uniform. It was there he learned about precision, how to read blueprints, how to design something that could withstand pressure. He learned that buildings and people aren't so different, both crumble without structure. He returned home in 1945 with a duffel bag and ambition. The GI Bill promised him loans for education and housing, but when he sat across from the bank clerk, the answer was polite and permanent. Not for your kind. He walked out of that building with no bitterness, only calculation. If the bank won't lend, he said to his wife, Evelyn, then we'll make the bank unnecessary. He opened a small mechanic shop on Claiborne Avenue, a street alive with noise, commerce, and constant change. The space was little more than a concrete floor and a flickering bulb, but it was his. He lived in the back room with Evelyn, one stove, one bed, one dream they didn't have to explain to anyone. The shop did well enough to keep food on the table. He saved every extra penny, not for comfort, but for leverage. One afternoon, a postal worker came in for a repair and mentioned that the building next door was being auctioned for unpaid taxes. Charles went to the auction, bought it for less than what some men spent on a suit, and rented it to a carpenter. The first time Evelyn called him a landlord, he smiled faintly. No, he said, we're investors. That single purchase became a pattern. He bought small, fixed what others ignored, and rented fair. He learned that dignity was the most reliable tenant. When people trust you, they stay. Within 5 years, he owned 6 buildings, 2 storefronts, 4 houses, and a reputation for discipline. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't explain himself. His neighbors respected him because he seemed to know something they didn't, how to move without noise. Still, New Orleans had a way of testing anyone who rose too high. There were whispers. How could a black man buy so much property without a white partner? Some said he had friends downtown, a Creole banker who hid behind his name, a politician's cousin who owed him favors. Others claimed he used his shop as a front for loan sharking. He ignored them all. People only whisper, he said, when the truth is too loud. In 1950, he made his first bold move, a grocery store on Claiborne Avenue. It had been a failed business for years, run by a man who sold spoiled food at premium prices. Charles saw what it could be. He bought it, cleaned it, and restocked it with produce from black farmers outside Baton Rouge. Evelyn handled the money. He handled the vendors. They built something rare, a business that treated customers like investors. He told his staff, when they shop here, they're not spending money. They're circulating it. Every Friday, the store turned into a classroom. Evelyn would clear the aisles and teach neighbors about credit, budgeting, and saving. Charles would join them at the end, showing how small investments could buy independence. The banks called it naive. The people called it liberation. Their success attracted attention they didn't want. City inspectors appeared with new requirements, new fees, new headaches. When a man from downtown offered to buy the grocery for 3 times its value, Charles said no. A week later, vandals shattered the windows. He replaced the glass, installed thicker panes, and added more light. When friends urged him to fight back, he said, "You can't fight a system with fists. You fight it with paperwork." He paid his taxes early, filed his documents in triplicate, and never missed a deadline. Bureaucracy was his bulletproof vest. By 1953, he had begun forming what he called the Circle. It wasn't a company, at least not legally. It was a coalition. Barbers, teachers, and small business owners pooling their money to buy property together. Each contributed a modest share. Each received a portion of the rent. They called it Robinson Enterprises, though it was more philosophy than firm. If they won't lend to us, he told them, we'll lend to ourselves. It worked. They bought duplexes, converted warehouses, opened more shops. Every time one project succeeded, they started another. Claiborne Avenue began to change. There was prosperity, then pride, and for a moment it felt like the city couldn't ignore them. But progress in New Orleans always comes with paperwork and politics. Inspectors arrived again, suddenly finding violations in buildings that had passed every test the year before. Permits were delayed, licenses disappeared. When a developer offered to buy him out quietly, Charles smiled and said, "If you want it, build your own." He began working nights, walking the blocks he owned, talking with tenants, listening to their stories. He said it helped him understand his buildings better. "Every wall has an echo," he said, "and it tells you who's missing." In 1958, he unveiled his most ambitious idea yet, a 2-block retail plaza financed entirely by the community. The stores were small, a barber, a pharmacy, a tailor, a bakery. But they represented something the city hadn't seen before. It was ownership disguised as commerce. On opening day, the air filled with music. A brass band played down the street. Families gathered in their Sunday clothes. The mayor sent a letter of congratulations but stayed home. Charles stood next to Evelyn, watching the crowd flow between the shops. "It's working," he whispered. She smiled. "Then build another." He never did. He didn't need to. The plaza became a symbol. People from other neighborhoods came just to see it. Children grew up believing it had always been there. But with every success, he grew quieter. "The higher you climb," he said, "the more wind you catch." By the end of the decade, his name carried weight in rooms he never entered. City officials who had once dismissed him now included his properties in their plans. He had become the rarest thing in New Orleans, a black man too valuable to evict and too quiet to accuse. Evelyn kept the ledgers neat. Charles kept the future steady. Together they made money look like stability instead of spectacle. He didn't trust the world yet, but the world had started trusting him. And in that fragile trust, he saw the first real sign of freedom. By the time the 1960s arrived, the streets of New Orleans carried a different kind of sound. The brass bands still played, but their songs were joined by voices marching, demanding, promising a world that might finally change. Claiborne Avenue, Charles Robinson Street, the line he had turned into an artery of community life, was suddenly marked on maps again, this time with red pencil and bureaucratic words like urban renewal. He knew what those words meant. Renewal meant removal. It meant the same city that ignored his grocery stores and apartments now wanted the land beneath them. He heard the rumors first from one of his tenants, a clerk at City Hall who swept the floors after the meetings. The man told him, "They're going to build a highway. Right through Tremé, right over Claiborne." Charles listened quietly. "Then we'll buy the dirt before they do," he said. And that night he sat at his kitchen table with Evelyn, maps spread like open wounds, drawing a plan to save what they had built. He called together everyone who would listen, barbers, church deacons, tailors, teachers, the same people who had built his circle a decade before. In the back of his grocery store, between the shelves of rice and beans, he spoke softly but firmly. "If they own the streets," he said, "we'll own what sits on top." They pooled what they could, small savings, retirement accounts, faith, and within months he had formed a trust. R&R Holdings, Robinson and Residence. It was a name that sounded polite enough to pass through any office, but everyone involved knew it was a barricade disguised as business. They moved quickly, buying houses, lots, corners, anywhere a bulldozer might aim. When the city began condemning land, the deeds were already filed in their names. The newspapers later called it a miracle of timing. But there was no miracle, only organization, paperwork, and a man who refused to let his people be erased. When the bulldozers came, the families stayed. When the city threatened lawsuits, the judges found everything in order. Robinson had beaten them with the same precision he once used to fix engines. He wasn't a protester, but his quiet defiance echoed louder than a megaphone. Activists invited him to rallies. He declined. "I don't march," he told them. "I mortgage." To some, it sounded cynical. To others, it was revelation. Not everyone could march, but everyone could own. The victory cost him. City inspectors began to visit again, their questions sharpened by resentment. Permits were delayed. Supplies went missing in transit. He responded with patience, the weapon he had perfected. He paid the fees, shook the hands, wrote the letters, waited them out. "They get tired quicker than we do," he told Evelyn. "They've never had to." She was still his partner, still the balance to his pragmatism. Her presence turned his empire human. Every month she gathered the tenants who were behind on rent and found ways to keep them housed. She gave out groceries in brown paper bags marked "paid in advance." She made sure the plaza hosted community dinners and literacy nights. When she fell ill in 1963, the doctors said it was nothing serious. They were wrong. The day she died, Charles sat in the store after closing, lights dimmed, smelling the bread she'd baked that morning. "She was my rhythm," he told his son, David. "Now I'm just keeping time." For a year, he barely spoke. He walked the blocks every night, touching the walls, checking doors. Tenants watched him from windows and whispered prayers. When David offered to take over, he refused. "I can't hand over something I haven't finished," he said. But slowly, he began to see that his son was not asking for inheritance. He was asking for partnership. David had studied finance at Xavier, learning the language of numbers that his father had always spoken instinctively. He wanted to modernize what his father had built, turn Robinson Enterprises into a formal corporation, issue shares, attract larger investors. Charles listened, amused. "You want to invite strangers to the dinner table," he said. "They'll eat the food and sell the chairs." David argued that times were changing, that visibility could protect them. "The more people know who we are," he said, "the harder it'll be for them to erase us." Charles shook his head. "Visibility," he said, "is just vulnerability with good lighting." But he also knew his son was right about one thing. The world was moving, so he compromised. Together, they founded Robinson Credit, a small lending office on Claiborne that served the people banks wouldn't. Tailors, barbers, teachers, young couples wanting to buy their first homes. The loans were small, the paperwork simple, the terms fair. "A community," Charles said, "should have its own bank before it has its own mayor." The business grew faster than either expected. By 1965, Robinson Credit was financing half the small businesses in Tremé. Some repaid early, some needed help. No one was evicted. He taught his clerks to treat clients like neighbors, not numbers. He told them, "If a man can build something that feeds his family, lend him the tools before you lend him the lecture." But the city didn't stop pressing. In 1966, officials returned with new plans for the expressway. They couldn't take his land, but they could strangle it with zoning laws. They declared certain areas commercial only, others unfit for habitation. The trick was simple: force his tenants out by making it illegal for them to live where they'd always lived. He fought back in court. The hearings dragged on for months, filled with polite racism dressed as legal language. He brought documents for every property, witnesses for every accusation. He won again, but every victory drained him. He was getting older. His hands, once so steady, began to tremble when he signed papers. His heart, strong as the walls he built, began to tire. The doctor told him to rest. He nodded and went back to work. "Buildings fall," he said, "when no one watches them." Behind his calm, the stress was visible. His hair grayed, his suits loosened, yet his eyes stayed sharp. He began preparing for the day he wouldn't be here. He transferred ownership of some properties to community trusts. He left others to his employees, especially the women who had managed his offices for decades. He told David, if people have a stake, they'll protect it longer than money will. It was his version of immortality. In 1967, the Chamber of Commerce tried to honor him. They invited him to a luncheon, a plaque, a handshake for public relations. He declined the luncheon and accepted the plaque. He put it not in his office, but in the grocery store. When a clerk asked why, he said, because that's where the people can see what they built. Rumors returned, because success always invites them. Some said he had offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Others said he'd partnered with a white real estate syndicate that used his name to avoid scrutiny. He never denied, never confirmed. When a journalist pressed him, he replied, every myth has a use. Let them think I'm bigger than I am. Maybe it'll scare them into leaving me alone. In private, he laughed about it. They think I'm hiding treasure, he told David. All I ever hid was receipts. That year, his health failed again. He began to hand more to David, trusting that the next generation would keep the rhythm. Don't chase profit, he said. Chase permanence. David nodded, but he was still young enough to think the two could be the same. Charles smiled at that. Then maybe you'll do what I couldn't, he said. In his final months, he wrote letters to everyone who mattered, lawyers, tenants, pastors, friends. Some were instructions, others blessings. Every letter ended the same way, keep it standing. He passed away quietly in 1971 in his home on Gentilly Boulevard. No grand funeral, no parade, just family, friends, and the people he'd housed. The mayor sent flowers, but not his presence. The city's newspapers printed short obituaries. Businessman, landlord, philanthropist. But in Treme, the lights in his building stayed on all night. People left candles on their porches and the glow reflected in the windows of the plaza he'd built. They called it the Robinson Light. For days, that street shimmered gold at dusk. Even the city couldn't dim it. It wasn't mourning. It was acknowledgement. The man who had turned paperwork into protection, patience into power, had left a map for survival written in property lines and trust funds. New Orleans would keep moving, but now part of it would always move to his rhythm. After he was gone, the city went back to its rhythm of noise and forgetting. But in certain corners, on Claiborne, in Treme, in the half-lit grocery where the air still smelled faintly of sugar and oil, his presence lingered. People spoke his name in the same tone they used for landmarks, half history, half direction. That building, they'd say. Robinson used to own that. David inherited the ledgers, the properties, and the questions. The ledgers were written in his father's neat block letters, one page for every parcel, one note repeated like prayer. Keep it standing. The questions came from bankers, lawyers, and journalists who had ignored his father in life, but suddenly wanted to measure him in death. They asked where the money came from, how much there really was, what secrets the old man had left behind. David answered them all the same way. Everything you need to know is on paper. They looked at the paper and still didn't understand. The estate was difficult to untangle. There were properties under names no one recognized, trusts that listed tenants as beneficiaries, accounts that led back to churches and schools. Some documents seemed to contradict others. It was as if Charles had written his legacy in code. Lawyers whispered about offshore holdings, a second portfolio hidden beyond the city's reach. None of it could be proven. David decided not to chase ghosts. If he wanted us to find it, he told his sister, he would have left a map. What he did find were the deeds, real, heavy, undeniable. 32 properties across the city, still generating rent, still housing families, and the grocery, still open, run by the same manager who had started as a clerk under Evelyn. The woman refused to take a raise. He taught me to read a ledger, she said. That was payment enough. In the early 1970s, the city shifted again. The Claiborne Expressway was finished, a concrete scar running above the old oak trees. Many of the small shops under it closed. The plaza survived, partly out of loyalty, partly out of structure. David modernized it. Added a hardware store, a dry cleaner, a diner. He created a foundation in his father's name to manage the profits. The foundation paid for scholarships, small business loans, and repairs to the properties that bore the weight of time. It was quiet work, just as his father would have wanted. Still, the myths persisted. A reporter once claimed that a sealed safe had been discovered under the grocery floor during renovation, filled with cash and deeds. Another story told of a Robinson Trust in the Caribbean holding millions in unclaimed assets. No evidence ever surfaced, but the rumors gave people comfort. They liked to believe the man who had outsmarted the city might still be outsmarting death. The truth was humbler and harder. His wealth wasn't hidden in safes. It was embedded in people. Dozens of families still lived in homes he had sold to them on terms so generous, they called them blessings. The cooperative loans he'd started continued through church credit unions. The city's new generation of black entrepreneurs, store owners, mechanics, restaurateurs, many of them traced their first opportunities to a loan that carried his name, but not his interest rate. Hurricanes came and went. Betsy, then Camille, then others whose names faded with the news cycle. His buildings bent but didn't break. He overbuilt everything, one contractor joked. But to those who had lived through the floods, those sturdy walls were proof of something greater than craftsmanship. They were evidence of intention. Charles Robinson hadn't just built for profit. He had built for endurance. In the 80s, the city began to rediscover him. Historians pieced together his story from property records and oral histories. They wrote essays calling him the quiet architect of Black New Orleans. David gave a few interviews but declined most. "My father didn't build for museums," he said. "He built for Mondays." The family avoided public celebration. They feared visibility the way Charles had taught them to, as the first step toward being taken. By the time David's children came of age, Robinson properties were landmarks in everything but name. The plaza still anchored Claiborne. The apartments still housed working families. The grocery had been turned into a co-op owned by its employees. The foundation quietly expanded its reach, funding literacy programs, trade schools, and housing grants. Every document, every contract still carried his father's final instruction at the bottom: keep it standing. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina tested that promise. Water swallowed the streets and levees failed. When the flood receded, most of the neighborhood was gone. The grocery's first floor filled with mud. The plaza's windows shattered, yet the structures held. When volunteers arrived weeks later, they found families camped inside, safe and dry. Someone had painted across the cracked brick of the plaza's outer wall, still standing. The photo ran in national newspapers. No one mentioned Charles Robinson. They didn't need to. His name was already in the concrete. After the storm, his descendants rebuilt again. They repaired the roofs, restored the businesses, reopened the co-op. They used his ledgers like blueprints, following the same pattern: own, repair, reinvest. The foundation became a partner in city redevelopment projects, ensuring that new affordable housing stayed under local control. They refused to sell to outside developers. "We've seen what happens when you sell too much," David's daughter said. "You lose the rhythm." Today, Claiborne Avenue looks different. Some blocks are new, some are ruins. But when the light hits in late afternoon, the buildings he raised still catch it just so, the same golden shimmer people once called the Robinson glow. Children play beneath the expressway, vendors set up stalls, the city keeps moving, and the structures keep holding. His story has become part of the city's folklore, half fact, half faith. Older men tell it in barbershops: the mechanic who became a mogul, the landlord who fought bulldozers with patience. Church elders quote his sayings like scripture: "You can't shoot paperwork. Tools rust, land appreciates. Don't chase profit, chase permanence." They laugh after each one because they sound like jokes until you realize they're instructions. Every generation finds its own version of him. Some see a hero, others a cautionary tale, A few call him the patron saint of due diligence, but no one denies his impact. Even the city, which once tried to bury him under asphalt, eventually acknowledged the debt. A small plaque on a corner of the plaza now bears his name, though his family never asked for it. Tourists pass it without noticing. Locals nod when they see it, like greeting an old friend. He never wanted monuments. Names fade, he used to say. Buildings don't. And he was right. The buildings outlasted him, outlasted the politics, outlasted the storms. They stand as proof that ordinary people can build permanence out of chaos, that ownership can be quiet rebellion, that freedom can be managed brick by brick. If you walk those streets at dusk, you can still feel his presence, not haunting, but humming, steady as an engine that refuses to stall. The city breathes through its music, but it stands because of people like him, people who never waited for permission to build, who turned patience into legacy. Charles Robinson never saw himself as visionary. He just believed that if you built something to last, it would speak for you after you were gone. And it has. In every rented room that became a home, in every business loan that became a foundation, in every brick that has survived flood and time, his voice is still there, whispering the same instruction he left behind. Keep it standing.